Hey friends. Okay, we're going to do a quick review of just, well, not even really a review, but an opportunity to practice some basic things that we need to do in AP Lit. So we're going to practice these basic things at a pretty basic level that will help you get to the point where you're confident that you can always earn the thesis point, and where you're confident that you can at least get to a 2 for evidence and commentary, and probably higher. So today's agenda is that we're going to read a poem. The one we're going to read is Como lo siento by Lorna D. Cervantes. I will link that in the description. We're going to practice writing thematic statements with that. Just super basic. This is just me trying to get the thesis point to those that are a little bit more complex and harder. We'll turn those thematic statements into theses that will earn the thesis point, and then we'll choose evidence to support those theses and or a thesis, and then do a little bit of analysis of that evidence to make sure that it's clearly linked to the argument that is advanced in the thesis. So the first thing is there are some basic steps, and I'm probably at some point in this video going to mistakenly interchange the word thesis with the phrase thematic statement. A thematic statement is really just like, what is the author trying to convey to me? What am I supposed to get out of this about some essential part of being a human in the world? Or I don't know, maybe it's an insect in the world or whatever, but what point is the author trying to get across? Larger point. And then it becomes a thesis when we're doing it as an argument, when we're linking it to, okay, this is my response to a question. So every AP Lit essay requires a thesis. It's part of the scoring guidelines, and it's just also a fundamental part of constructing a decent argument. So what do you need to do? Well, the first thing is that you need to read the piece. And this sounds obvious, but it is essential, because if you are not a competent reader and you are not coming to like a basic factual literal understanding of what's being said, then you're going to have a very hard time writing about it. So read the piece and read it carefully. Then you need to ask yourself, okay, what themes do I see here? And at this point, it's just a brainstorming stage. What thematic subjects do I see here? Do I see, you know, love, loss, grief, coming of age, et cetera, et cetera? We all know the themes. We've been hearing about them for, I don't know, since 5th grade, 6th grade, 7th grade, 8th grade. Once you've brainstormed a whole bunch of themes, then you're going to ask yourself, okay, well, what does this piece in particular have to say about that theme? We want to avoid generality, because the more specific and the tighter a thematic statement is, the better our odds are of being able to prove it. So we need to think about the specifics of a piece. What argument is it making about this broader theme? So we're going to look at specific elements in the text, and then, you know, do some tone analysis, because what you talk about is of consequence, but how you talk about it is also of consequence. After that, we're going to write theme statements that capture theme plus attitude, what the writer is trying to say about the subject at hand, and then we'll find evidence to support the statement that we just wrote. So we'll start with this poem. After this, I'll read the poem to you, and then I want you to hit pause and make a list of thematic subjects and identify where we would put a tone shift. So again, this poem is called Como lo siento, and it's by Lorna D. Cervantes. I heard an owl at midday. A crow flew, spiraled, drifted, and I thought of the circle my own life made, and how at heart I'm a hoverer, the way I've always drifted toward you. Another owl lifted from the palm. She showed me how I rose, caught in the wind by your skin and tongue. I feel scooped from the banks like clay, smoked and fired by your eyes till I ring. I'm paralyzed by joy, and I forget how to act. I'm a shell in the cliffs, 1,000 miles from sea. You tide me and I rise, and there's no truth more simple. Okay, so now pause for a second. Make sure you understand what's literally going on, and then make a quick list of thematic subjects. Try and come up with as many as you can, and identify where we would put a tone shift in this poem, because it's just much easier when you're writing an essay to have a tone shift so that you know how you're going to organize your essay. So hit pause for a second, and then come back when you've got a list of thematic subjects. Okay, so probably you've got thematic subjects like, well, first the literal. What's going on? She's out there, she hears an owl in the middle of the day, and then there are these birds, and the crow is doing its thing, it's circling, and she's like, huh, that makes me think about my own life and how it's kind of gone in circles and I hover, but this whole time I thought I was hovering, I was really drifting toward you. And then I saw another owl lifted from the palm. Is that a tree or like the palm of her hand? It's hard to say. She showed me how I rose, how I was caught in the wind. So how I rose, I was caught in the wind by your skin and tongue. So like the strength of this attraction has raised her up higher. I feel scooped from the banks like clay, smoked and fired by your eyes till I ring. So she feels like kind of not dirt, but clay, where she's been scooped out and then she's been shaped into something else. When she says smoked and fired, it means that she's been forged. This clay has been made into something else. And pots, good quality pots, clay pots, will ring if you flick them with your finger. So then I'm just like, I'm so taken away by this that I'm paralyzed and I forget how to act. And she feels out of her element. She's a shell in the cliffs. The sea is a million miles away, but somehow she's this prehistoric, well, not a million, 1,000. She's this prehistoric shell that's caught in the cliffs. And then you tied me, this reference to the ebb and flow of tides, and the rise and fall of the ocean. You tied me and I rise. You lift me up. And that's the simple truth. So that's the literal, what's going on. And the thematic subjects that you can see in there are things like love, obviously. There's this self-awareness, this reflection of the self and what's going on in nature, this sort of being swept away by this relationship. What can happen, paralyzed by joy. You forget, anybody who's ever had a crush knows that sometimes you forget how to act. And then this feeling of being like, I don't know, it's almost like this restoration, this opportunity to become more. So I kind of take away from this one that there's already this self-awareness about who the speaker is, but then this like, oh, okay, well, now that I'm in love with this person who I seem to have been drifting toward forever, that I can become even more than that. So the next step, now that you've read the poem, is to try and write a statement that captures what the poet is trying to say. So sometimes in AP Lit, people are looking for formulas. I'm not a huge fan of formulas, but sometimes they're effective. So we'll start with a real simple one that will get you to the point that you need to get to answer a question. This is super simple. Subject plus tone. Pick one of the subjects that was on your list. What attitude is the writer talking about that in, or the character talking about that subject in? And if you think about that, that will lead you to what the writer is trying to convey about that subject. So if you want a very simple sentence frame, you can say the speaker feels X about whatever subject. Pros of this, it's easy, it's defensible, assuming that you have a good literal reading of the poem. And it'll get the thesis point if you turn this into a thesis, which we'll talk about later. If you say something about techniques, it'll get the thesis point. The cons, of course, are that it's boring and superficial, but sometimes that's fine. You just need to get the job done. So pause for a second, go back to that poem, and write a statement that fits within this frame. The speaker feels X about Y. You may not be enamored with it, but it is perfectly serviceable. So pause for a minute and write yourself a statement like that. Okay, now that you've done that, let's try one that is a little more complex. So all of these prompts are, when we're dealing with prompts in AP Lit, they're looking for some complexity. They're looking for some tension. So in order to get to there, you can adopt a slightly more complex formula. The thematic subject plus the change in tone. So we identified a tone shift. So we may be overall talking about this thematic subject, but at the beginning, we're talking about it this way. And at the end, we're talking about it this way. So what does that shifting complex attitude tell us about the argument that's being made about that thematic subject? So maybe you want to say something like the speaker's initial attitude about the subject is whatever you think it is, and then it shifts to something else because of something that happened or some essential truth. Or you can also approach it from a different direction. The speaker feels however they feel about the subject, but they also feel this other thing because of something else that happened, or so it causes them to do this or that or the third. Note that at this point, we're getting to the point where we're talking about complexity, not just contradictions in how a speaker feels about something or a writer or a character feels about something, but also we're starting to explore the relationships between ideas. The words because and so and all of their various synonyms suggest relationships, and they suggest cause and effect relationships. If you use the word but or yet or on the other hand or whatever other synonym you want to use for that, that tells us that there's some conflict there. And when we can mine conflict, we can get to really good analysis. So pause for a second and write yourself, not a second, pause for like 3 minutes and write yourself a couple of sentences where you adopt this sort of formula to get to some complexity about what's going on in the passage or the poem. Okay. So now you've tried it that way, and you can probably see the difference, right? You can see a more complete understanding starting to develop when you're thinking about not just the thematic subject, but okay, now how are we talking about this? What changes do we see in the emotional weight that's put on this subject? But there are, of course, more ways to do this. One of them, you could even use a syllogism. So I like logic. I avoided taking math classes in college because, it just wasn't really, I never thought of myself as a math person. Now I'm old enough to know and wise enough to know that there's no such thing as a math person. Well, right? Isn't that right? Anyway, logical reasoning is a mathematical pursuit. So logic is one of the fundamental precepts of logic is if-then statements. So if one thing occurs, another thing will occur. So I want to give you an example of this one. You could say, if this condition is met, and if also this condition is met, then this thing will happen. So if we apply it to this poem that we just read, it can come out looking something like this. If you already know who you are, and if you find someone who both celebrates and elevates you, then you will feel fulfilled and maybe disoriented by love. Okay. So if you want to pause here and try writing one of those are fun too. Okay. Key point here is that all of these can be expanded to multiple sentences. This is one reason why I'm kind of reluctant sometimes to provide sentence frames and things like that, because it can make students feel like they're constrained, like you must smush all of this into this little tiny space. You can expand to multiple sentences. These are, of course, not the only ways to do this. The keys to remember are, if you're going to write a quality thematic statement, you need to make sure that it is defensible, which means that it needs to be true, which means that you need to be a good reader. You also want to be sure that it's capturing some complexity that is worthy of the piece that you're responding to. And also explaining relationships between ideas. This gets you into the critical land of the line of reasoning in the AP Lit scoring guidelines, because it's really critical to be able to establish a clear pathway between where you started and where you ended up. So let's say I come up with a thesis or a thematic statement like this. Cervantes makes the argument that her speaker's love is both an expansion of who she already was and a road to becoming something more than she thought she was. But there is tension in the dependence love can make a person feel. Okay, there are many, many, many things that you could write about this poem, but this is what I'm writing today. Ask me tomorrow and maybe I'll write something different. So let's say we come up with something like that. Now, how do I turn it? How do I turn that theme statement into a thesis? Well, it's pretty straightforward. You don't have to name literary devices when you're responding to an AP Lit prompt. So you can just say something general like the poet uses a variety of, a litany of, a multitude of techniques, elements, strategies, whatever, in order to do this thing that they're trying to do. Or you can write another sentence after your theme statement that says something like, the writer drives this sentiment home with a litany of techniques. So it may come out like this, and I've given you a couple examples there. I just highlighted the parts that I inserted in order to make this into a thesis that will meet the criteria for a successful AP English Literature thesis. Then we got to remember that the best way to fact check your thesis or your theme statement is to find evidence that supports it. If you are finding evidence in your passage and you're like, wow, this is really interesting language, I think I want to use this, but I can't figure out how it connects to my theme statement, probably it's not the best evidence for you to use. That either means that you need to change your evidence or you need to change your thesis. So let's say again that this is my thesis. I'm going to have you hit pause for a second. I've underlined the parts of my thesis that are things that I need to prove, right? We have to remember, we have to observe and preserve that clear line of reasoning that carries all the way through from the very top of your essay to the very bottom of your essay, where it's obvious how all of these ideas are connected and you are illustrating the connection between those ideas. This means that when I write a thesis statement, I need to be sure to understand the commitments that I've made. So I underlined the things in here that are my interpretations, because if it's my interpretation, then I need to find evidence to prove it. So now is the time for you to look at the statements that I've made here and then go back to that poem and find some evidence that I could use to prove one or more of these parts. I probably should have said hit pause, but if you haven't yet, hit pause. Go take like 5 minutes to go find some evidence to prove part of this thesis. Okay, so if we go to mine, I split this poem in half, and you can see where I put the tone shift. You actually, if you were an astute observer, you saw this at the beginning. I saw the beginning of this poem as sort of talking about an expansion of the existing self, and then the next part to be, you know, pushing into something else, becoming something else, and feeling tension, not necessarily bad tension, but tension as a result of that. So you notice that, I mean, one of the joys of poetry is that pretty much every word matters, which means that sometimes you can go through there looking for evidence to prove your point. It feels like you have essentially the whole thing highlighted. So then the next thing that you have to put you have to put your evidence through this process of deciding, okay, are these just lovely, marvelous words that I'm confident mean something? Or am I confident that these are not just lovely and marvelous words, but I can connect them to the argument that I'm trying to make? So there are a couple of these that I highlighted because I saw patterns. I see 2 owls and a crow, so there are birds there, both of which have symbolic meaning. You don't have to know that, though. You could write an essay where you don't talk anything about the symbolism of owls and crows. I also noticed the repetition of spiraled and circle. See how a spiral is kind of a whole bunch of circles, and the repetition of the word drifted. I wanted to talk about those. So these are some pieces these are some words and phrases that I would use. So then you got to decide what to do with the evidence. Well, it's simple. It's simple, but it's not easy. You just need to explain. All you need to do, children, is explain how this evidence, the method that you've cited, produces an effect on a reader or reflects an effect on a speaker or character, and how that effect proves the meaning that you came up with for your thematic statement. So let's go back to my thesis again. There it is again. I won't read it to you again for the 1000th time. But now I have to figure out which evidence I want to use to support it. So let's say I'm going to talk about these words. At heart, I'm a hoverer. Let's say first, that I saw that owl in the first line and I was like, ooh, owls. Owls mean something. I want to talk about them. And then I'm like, scribble, scribble, scribble. What am I going to say about owls? I have no idea. They're really pretty. They're silent when they fly. I got nothing. Well, then I need to move on from owls and talk about different evidence. Don't hinge a lot of your argument or invest a lot of your time in evidence that you can't clearly connect to the thesis that you wrote. Because if you do that, then your line of reasoning will break and you will top out at a 2 on evidence and commentary. So let's say I know exactly what to do with these words. I can't just take these big chunks and drop them into my essay. I need to treat these things a little bit at a time. So I might start by saying this. By talking about who she is at heart, the speaker addresses both her inherent characteristics, who she is at her center, while also alluding to love as a matter of the heart. I could also say she notes that she's always been a hoverer, like one of the birds looking at the landscape below her, but she's now realizing that she wasn't just hovering. Instead, she has drifted in response to some unseen force. This drifting wasn't aimless, despite the word's connotations. It was toward this end, which marks the beginning of a shift between the hoverer she thought she was and the partner she has become. So you can start to see how I'm connecting pieces of evidence both to my theme statement and to one another. And because I set this up so that I'm going to proceed through this poem in a chronological way, using that tone shift that I marked as the delineation point between my first paragraph and my second paragraph, I can work through this in a systematic way and I can show the progression between the ideas that I advanced in my thesis. So to sum up, remember, focus on a complex thematic statement, and then choose evidence that is compelling, it's visual, it's evocative, it is some technique, and make sure that you can clearly connect that evidence to your theme statement. And also realize that in order to build a clear and compelling line of reasoning, your pieces of evidence need to connect both to your thematic statement and to each other. How do they show change, or how do they collect into patterns? And that's all I got for you today. Hopefully it was helpful. At the very minimum, hopefully you love this poem because it's great. Bye.